The building's security staff had grown comfortable with Sarah's presence in a way that made her functionally invisible during their daily operations. Head of security, James Patterson, was a former police detective who ran his department with professional competence, but without the kind of tactical thinking that would be necessary in a military-style assault. Patterson often discussed security procedures within Sarah's hearing, treating her as part of the building's infrastructure rather than a potential intelligence asset, never realizing that she was evaluating his protocols with the critical eye of someone who'd spent years identifying weaknesses in defensive positions. Sarah had observed that the security checkpoints were designed to screen for conventional threats like weapons and explosives, but they relied heavily on technology that could be defeated by someone with the right equipment and training. The guards themselves were competent professionals, but they were trained for deterrence and investigation rather than active combat, and their positioning throughout the building followed patterns that would be predictable to anyone conducting surveillance. The emergency response protocols assumed that threats would come from individual actors rather than coordinated teams, and the communication systems that connected different security stations could be disrupted by someone who understood the building's infrastructure. The executive protection details that would be present during the shareholders meeting were primarily focused on discrete threat assessment rather than active defense, with bodyguards who were trained to evacuate their principals rather than engage hostile forces. Sarah had noted that these teams operated independently rather than as part of a coordinated security structure, creating communication gaps that could be exploited by attackers who understood how corporate security functioned. The executives themselves had been briefed on basic safety protocols, but their training focused on situations like medical emergencies and natural disasters rather than the kind of tactical scenarios that Sarah had been trained to survive. As the weeks leading up to the shareholders meeting progressed, Sarah found herself unconsciously falling back into the intelligence gathering patterns that had made her effective in special operations. She cataloged the daily routines of key personnel, mapped the traffic patterns that would indicate normal operations versus potential threats, and identified the subtle changes in building security that suggested preparation for the high-profile event. Her military training had taught her that successful operations depended on understanding the environment completely, knowing not just the physical layout, but the human patterns that determined how people would react under stress. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on Sarah as she went through the motions of civilian life while simultaneously conducting the kind of threat assessment that had once been her full-time occupation. She'd chosen the receptionist position specifically because it seemed to represent everything that military life wasn't: predictable, safe, focused on helping people rather than eliminating them. But as she watched the pieces of what was obviously a carefully planned operation falling into place around her, she realized that some skills were too deeply ingrained to ever truly abandon, and some responsibilities too fundamental to walk away from when innocent lives were at stake. The building's daily rhythm had become as familiar to her as the sound of her own heartbeat, a pattern of arrivals and departures, meetings and phone calls, routine maintenance and security checks that created the background noise of corporate normalcy. She knew which executives arrived early and which ones rushed in just before important meetings, which security guards were most attentive to details, and which ones had grown complacent from years of uneventful shifts, which maintenance workers could be trusted to notice unusual activity, and which ones were focused solely on completing their assigned tasks. This knowledge had accumulated gradually, the result of 3 years of careful observation disguised as efficient service, but it was about to become the foundation for decisions that would determine whether the shareholders meeting became a footnote in corporate history or a tragedy that would be remembered for decades. The morning of the shareholders meeting arrived with the kind of crisp desert clarity that made Phoenix feel like the center of the universe. All blue skies and golden sunlight, painting the glass towers of downtown in shades that photographers spent careers trying to capture. Sarah arrived at Meridian Corporate Tower at her usual time, but the building hummed with an energy that was different from normal business days, the kind of controlled excitement that came when millions of dollars and hundreds of careers hung in the balance of a single day's decisions. The marble lobby had been polished to mirror brightness, the security checkpoints staffed with additional personnel, and the flower arrangements replaced with elaborate displays that spoke to the importance of the day's proceedings, the catering. Trucks had begun arriving before dawn, their crews wheeling cases of champagne and elaborate hors d'oeuvres through service entrances that bypassed the main security checkpoints, a detail that would have concerned Sarah more if she hadn't personally verified the credentials of every vendor involved in the event. The conference facilities on the 42nd floor had been transformed into something resembling a corporate palace, with presentation screens the size of movie theater displays and seating arrangements that had been planned with the precision of a military operation, every chair positioned to optimize sight lines and facilitate the kind of networking that turned business relationships into billion-dollar partnerships. Executive assistants moved through the building with the focused intensity of battlefield medics, coordinating schedules and managing logistics with an attention to detail that would have impressed drill sergeants, their Bluetooth headsets crackling with constant updates about arrival times and last-minute changes that threatened to cascade into the kind of chaos that could derail months of planning. Sarah watched them work from her position at the reception desk, noting the way stress made people careless about security protocols, how the pressure of managing important events created exactly the kind of distractions that skilled operators could exploit to move through secure areas without attracting attention. The first wave of executives had begun arriving at 8:30, their town cars pulling up to the building's main entrance in a carefully orchestrated sequence that allowed each arrival to make the kind of entrance that reinforced corporate hierarchies and personal brands. Sarah recognized most of the faces from financial magazines and business television, titans of industry who controlled assets that dwarfed the gross domestic product of small nations, men and women whose decisions about interest rates and investment strategies rippled through global markets like earthquakes. They moved through the lobby with the confident stride of people accustomed to having the world accommodate their schedules. Their conversations focused on acquisition targets and regulatory challenges rather than the mundane security concerns that occupied Sarah's attention. Regional directors from Los Angeles arrived in a group, their California casual dress codes adapted for Arizona formality, but still carrying the subtle signals of West Coast privilege that distinguished them from their East Coast counterparts. They discussed market volatility and cryptocurrency regulations while waiting for elevator access, their voices carrying the kind of insider knowledge that moved stock prices and influenced federal policy, never suspecting that the woman arranging flowers nearby had once briefed generals on strategic assessments that determined the fate of nations. Sarah processed their conversation with the same analytical detachment she'd once applied to enemy radio intercepts, cataloging information about corporate vulnerabilities and internal conflicts that revealed more about Meridian Financial's operational security than any formal assessment. The New York contingent announced their presence with the kind of aggressive punctuality that made schedule coordination an exercise in diplomatic precision. Their arrival times, calculated to demonstrate respect for local customs, while maintaining the kind of competitive positioning that characterized relationships between financial centers. Sarah had coordinated their transportation from Sky Harbor International Airport, ensuring that their hotel accommodations and ground transportation met the standards expected by executives who considered first-class airline service to be barely adequate for cross-country travel. These were people who measured time in milliseconds when it came to high-frequency trading, but expected others to wait indefinitely for their convenience. Building security had been reinforced with additional personnel borrowed from other Meridian Financial facilities. Guards who'd been briefed on protocols specific to high-value executive protection, but who lacked the familiarity with the building's layout that would be crucial in an emergency situation. Sarah observed their deployment with the critical eye of someone trained to identify defensive weaknesses, noting how their positions were optimized for normal crowd control rather than tactical defense. How their communication systems relied on commercial cellular networks that could be easily disrupted by someone with the right equipment and training. The parking garage beneath the tower had been swept for explosive devices using procedures that Sarah recognized as adequate for conventional threats, but insufficient for military-grade ordnance, particularly the kind of shaped charges that could be concealed in vehicles and detonated remotely to create diversions or block escape routes. She'd noted the absence of systematic vehicle inspections beyond basic visual sweeps, a gap in security protocols that reflected the corporate assumption that threats would come from individual actors, rather than coordinated teams with military training and sophisticated equipment. Communication systems throughout the building had been tested and redundancies established, but Sarah recognized that the backup networks relied on infrastructure that could be compromised through physical access to utility rooms and server closets that were secured with electronic locks rather than physical barriers. The building's fire suppression and climate control systems were controlled through network interfaces that prioritized convenience over security, creating potential access points for attackers who understood how modern commercial buildings integrated their mechanical and electronic systems. Emergency evacuation procedures had been reviewed with key personnel, but the briefings focused on orderly egress rather than tactical scenarios where elevators might be compromised and stairwells could become death traps for people unfamiliar with urban combat environments. Sarah had reviewed the official evacuation plans, noting that they assumed cooperation from building occupants and the availability of emergency services, assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong if the building came under attack from professionally trained operators who understood how to neutralize first responder capabilities. The conference facilities themselves had been configured with presentation technology that required network connections to external servers, creating potential access points for cyber attacks that could disable communication systems or provide intelligence about the meeting's proceedings to hostile actors. Sarah had observed the technical setup process, noting that the contractors responsible for audiovisual systems had access to secure areas without the kind of background screening that would be standard for personnel handling classified information. Another gap in security protocols that reflected civilian rather than military thinking about operational security. Catering arrangements had been coordinated through vendors who'd provided services for previous corporate events. Their credentials verified through commercial databases rather than the kind of comprehensive background investigations that would be conducted for personnel with access to high-value targets. Sarah had watched the catering staff move through the building, noting their familiarity with service routes and freight elevators that bypassed normal security checkpoints, knowledge that could be valuable for operators planning infiltration or extraction routes that avoided areas under direct surveillance. The building's perimeter security relied heavily on electronic surveillance systems that provided excellent coverage of normal pedestrian and vehicle traffic but created blind spots that could be exploited by attackers who understood the positioning and capabilities of commercial security cameras. Sarah had mapped these blind spots during her daily observations, noting that the system had been designed to deter opportunistic crime rather than coordinate surveillance designed to defeat professional reconnaissance efforts. Financial markets opened with the kind of volatility that made days like the shareholders meeting critical for investor confidence, the kind of fluctuations that turned quarterly earnings reports into events with geopolitical significance when they involved institutions. The size of Meridian Financial. Sarah monitored market activity through news feeds and financial websites, understanding that the information being discussed in the 42nd floor conference room would influence trading decisions that affected pension funds and retirement, accounts belonging to millions of ordinary people who would never know how close they'd come to losing everything. Weather conditions remained ideal for the kind of precision operations that required clear sight lines and predictable environmental factors, with wind speeds and atmospheric conditions that would facilitate rather than complicate long-range engagements if the situation deteriorated to the point where tactical responses became necessary. Sarah noted these details with the automatic assessment patterns that had been drilled into her during sniper training. Environmental factors that most people considered irrelevant, but that could determine success or failure when split-second. Accuracy became the difference between protecting innocent lives and watching them end in violence. The morning progressed with the kind of orchestrated efficiency that characterized successful corporate events, each element falling into place according to schedules that had been refined through months of planning and coordination. But beneath the surface of professional competence, Sarah detected the subtle signs that suggested this day would become something other than a routine business meeting. Patterns of behavior and positioning that triggered instincts honed through years of surviving in environments where the difference between paranoia and preparation often determined who lived to see another sunrise. As 9 o'clock approached, and the last group of executives made their way to the 42nd floor conference facilities, Sarah felt the familiar weight settling into her bones that had once preceded combat operations, the hyper-awareness that came when training and experience combined to recognize threats that others couldn't see. The building settled into its role as host to one of the most important financial gatherings of the year. 300 of the most powerful people in corporate America, assembling to make decisions that would influence global markets for years to come. None of them suspecting that the quiet woman arranging flowers in the lobby was the only thing standing between them and a catastrophe that would reshape their understanding of how quickly civilized order could collapse into lethal chaos. First sign that something was fundamentally wrong came at 9:47. When Sarah noticed that the dark SUV she'd been monitoring for the past week had been joined by 2 identical vehicles, all 3 parked at strategic points around the building's perimeter with their occupants, maintaining the kind of disciplined stillness that suggested military coordination rather than coincidental positioning. From her reception desk, she could see the reflection of one vehicle in the polished granite wall of the lobby, its windows tinted dark enough to conceal the number of occupants, but positioned with clear sight lines to both the main entrance and the emergency exits that most visitors never noticed. The building's communication systems began experiencing what the IT department characterized as routine network fluctuations, brief interruptions in cellular service and internet connectivity that lasted just long enough to disrupt normal operations without triggering the backup protocols designed for major system failures. Sarah recognized these disruptions as the kind of electronic warfare techniques used to isolate targets and prevent coordination between security forces, a preliminary phase of operations designed to create confusion and delay effective response to whatever was coming next. She tested her own devices discreetly, confirming that commercial networks were being selectively jammed while emergency frequencies remained clear, a sophistication that suggested professional military capabilities rather than opportunistic criminal activity. Security cameras throughout the building's public areas began developing technical malfunctions that seemed random, but followed patterns that Sarah recognized from her intelligence training. Systematic degradation of surveillance capabilities that would create blind spots for operators who understood the building's security layout. The malfunctions progressed from the parking garage upward through the building's floors, suggesting that someone with access to the security system's central controls was methodically disabling cameras along specific routes while leaving others operational to maintain the appearance of normal functionality. Fire alarm systems in several mechanical areas triggered brief alerts that were quickly reset by automated protocols. Creating noise and confusion, that masked the sounds of movement in service areas where unauthorized personnel could position equipment or establish positions without detection by building occupants focused on their corporate responsibilities. Sarah noted that these alarms followed the same pattern as the camera malfunctions, progressing upward through the building in a sequence that suggested careful planning rather than random equipment failures. Emergency lighting systems throughout. The stairwells began cycling through test sequences that weren't scheduled in the building's maintenance protocols. Brief periods of darkness that would allow trained operators to move between floors without being visible to anyone using the emergency exits for legitimate purposes. Sarah had memorized the building's emergency lighting schedule during her first month on the job, understanding that such systems often provided crucial navigation aids during crisis situations, and the unauthorized testing suggested that someone was preparing to exploit these systems for operational advantages. Elevator banks serving the upper floors began experiencing intermittent service interruptions that the facilities management staff attributed to increased traffic volume from the shareholders meeting. But Sarah recognized these disruptions as deliberate attempts to control vertical movement within the building. The pattern of interruptions suggested that someone was testing their ability to isolate specific floors or trap occupants between levels, capabilities that would be essential for controlling the movements of high-value targets during an extended operationhva. Systems throughout the building shifted into emergency ventilation modes that weren't triggered by any detectable environmental factors, cycling massive volumes of air through the building's ductwork in patterns that could mask the deployment of chemical agents or create positive pressure differentials that would force smoke and gases into specific areas. Sarah had studied building environmental systems during urban warfare training, understanding how commercial climate control infrastructure could be weaponized by attackers who gained access to central control systems. The building's loading docks reported irregular deliveries from service companies that weren't scheduled for work that day, vehicles that presented proper credentials, but whose occupants seemed more interested in observing security procedures than performing actual maintenance or deliveries. Sarah monitored these reports through the facilities management communications that crossed her desk, noting that the unauthorized visits coincided with the systematic degradation of the building's security and communication systems. Perimeter security detected multiple individuals conducting what appeared to be routine pedestrian traffic around the building's exterior, but surveillance footage revealed movement patterns that suggested systematic reconnaissance rather than casual foot traffic. These individuals maintained the kind of dispersed positioning that would allow rapid coordination while avoiding the clustered formations that might attract attention from security personnel trained to recognize potential threats. Commercial vehicle traffic in the area increased significantly beyond normal patterns for that time of day, with delivery trucks and service vehicles positioning themselves at locations that provided clear sight lines to the building's entrances while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activity. Sarah noted that many of these vehicles bore the markings of companies that provided services to other buildings in the downtown area, a level of operational sophistication that suggested extensive planning and resource investment. Parking availability around the building's perimeter became unusually scarce as civilian vehicles were displaced by what appeared to be routine commercial and service traffic. But the pattern of displacement created clear fields of fire and vehicle positioning that would facilitate rapid extraction or provide cover for sustained operations. Sarah recognized these preparations as standard tactical positioning for urban operations, designed to control a specific area while maintaining plausible deniability about hostile intent. Radio frequency interference began affecting communication devices throughout the downtown area, subtle disruptions that wouldn't be noticed by casual users, but that would prevent coordination between law enforcement agencies and emergency services. Sarah detected these disruptions through her own monitoring equipment, recognizing the signature patterns of military-grade jamming systems designed to create communication blackouts without triggering the automated alerts that would indicate electronic warfare attacks. Weather monitoring stations reported unusual atmospheric readings that suggested the deployment of obscurant materials designed to reduce visibility for aerial surveillance or precision engagement by law enforcement. Snipers. These readings were subtle enough to be attributed to natural atmospheric conditions, but Sarah recognized the specific chemical signatures that indicated artificial smoke or aerosol deployment designed to create tactical advantages for ground-based operations. Financial markets began experiencing unusual trading patterns in Meridian Financial stock, with large volume transactions that suggested insider knowledge of upcoming events that would significantly impact the company's valuation. Sarah monitored these transactions through financial news feeds, understanding that such trading activity often preceded corporate events that would create dramatic stock price movements, whether through legitimate business announcements or catastrophic incidents that destroyed shareholder confidence. News outlets received anonymous tips about potential security incidents at downtown Phoenix office buildings, vague warnings that prompted increased police patrols and media attention that would ensure maximum visibility for whatever operation was being planned. Sarah noted that these tips were carefully crafted to increase law enforcement presence without providing specific enough information to prevent the operation, a technique designed to amplify the psychological impact of successful attacks. Emergency services throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area reported increased call volumes for incidents that required rapid response, but turned out to be false alarms or minor emergencies that tied up personnel and equipment without creating actual casualties. Sarah recognized this pattern as a classic diversion tactic designed to reduce the availability of first responders when genuine emergencies occurred, stretching emergency services thin across a wide geographic area. Social media monitoring systems detected increased chatter about corporate security vulnerabilities and potential targets for political or economic violence, discussions that appeared to be organic political discourse but followed patterns that suggested coordinated information operations designed to provide cover for actual attacks. Sarah had seen similar information campaigns during overseas operations where terrorist organizations used social media to normalize discussions about potential targets before conducting actual attacks. Corporate security assessments at other major financial institutions reported increased surveillance and probing activities that suggested systematic reconnaissance of multiple potential targets, indicating that any operation against Meridian Financial was part of a larger campaign, rather than an isolated incident. Sarah accessed this information through professional networks that she'd maintained since leaving military service, connections that provided intelligence about threats that weren't yet public knowledge. Air traffic control systems reported unusual private aircraft activity at regional airports, including aircraft that filed flight plans, but then deviated from reported routes in ways that suggested surveillance or positioning for rapid extraction operations. Sarah monitored these reports through aviation tracking websites, understanding that private aircraft often provided the most effective means of extraction for high-value operations that required rapid departure from target areas. Telecommunications infrastructure throughout the region began experiencing what network engineers characterized as routine maintenance testing. But the timing and scope of these activities suggested systematic preparation for communication disruptions that would prevent coordination between various government agencies and corporate security forces. Sarah recognized these preparations as standard doctrine for operations designed to maximize confusion and delay effective response to coordinated attacks. The cumulative effect of these indicators created a threat picture that would have triggered immediate evacuation procedures in any military installation, but civilian security protocols weren't designed to recognize the subtle patterns that preceded professional military operations. Sarah found herself in the unique position of being the only person in the building who possessed both the training to recognize these threat indicators and the access to information systems that would allow her to confirm that an attack was imminent rather than merely possible. As 10:15 approached and the shareholders' meeting entered its most critical phase, with executives making decisions that would determine the future direction of one of the world's largest financial institutions, Sarah realized that the careful planning and systematic preparation she'd been observing was about to transition into active operations. The building's security systems had been systematically compromised. Communication networks were being disrupted, and 300 of the most powerful people in corporate America were trapped in a conference room 42 floors above a city that was about to discover how quickly organized violence could shatter the illusion of civilized safety. The morning's careful orchestration of corporate power was about to collide with an operation planned and executed by professionals who understood that the greatest victories were achieved not through overwhelming force, but through superior preparation and the willingness to exploit the overconfidence of targets who'd never imagined that their wealth and position couldn't protect them from the kind of violence that shaped the rest of the world. At exactly 10:23, the lobby doors exploded inward with the devastating force of shaped charges that had been positioned during the night by operatives who understood that maximum psychological impact required overwhelming initial violence. Glass fragments scattered across the marble floor like deadly confetti while smoke billowed through the entrance, carrying the acrid smell of military explosives that instantly transported Sarah back to the mountains of Afghanistan, where she'd learned that survival depended on making the right decisions in the first 30 seconds of contact with enemy forces. The concussive blast triggered car alarms throughout the downtown area, their wailing sirens creating an acoustic backdrop that would mask the sounds of gunfire and tactical communications during the operation that was now beginning in earnest. 12 armed figures in tactical gear moved through the smoke with the fluid precision of a military unit that had rehearsed this exact scenario countless times, their weapons held with the casual competence of professionals who understood that firearms were tools rather than symbols of power. Each operator wore body armor that bore no identifying markings, but displayed the kind of equipment integration that suggested military rather than law enforcement backgrounds, with communication systems and tactical accessories positioned for maximum effectiveness during extended urban combat operations. Their faces were concealed behind ballistic masks that provided protection while maintaining the psychological advantage of anonymity, turning them into faceless instruments of violence that civilian populations were psychologically unprepared to confront. The building's main security checkpoint disappeared in a coordinated assault that eliminated resistance before the guards could react effectively. Professional violence applied with surgical precision against personnel who'd been trained for deterrence rather than combat. Sarah watched from her reception desk as security officers who'd seemed competent and alert moments earlier were overwhelmed by operators who moved with the kind of tactical sophistication that transformed individual combat skills into devastating collective capability. The speed and coordination of the assault demonstrated planning that extended far beyond simple robbery or terrorism, suggesting objectives that required control of the building rather than mere destruction or chaos. Emergency lighting systems throughout the lobby activated as the main electrical systems were systematically disabled, creating the kind of dramatic illumination that would ensure maximum psychological impact while providing the tactical lighting conditions that favored attackers who'd trained for combat in urban environments. Sarah noted that the emergency systems were functioning exactly as someone with detailed knowledge of the building's infrastructure would expect, confirming her assessment that this operation had been planned by professionals who understood how commercial buildings responded to various types of damage and system failures. Elevator banks serving all floors above the 20th level locked down automatically as building systems responded to the security breach. But Sarah recognized that this supposedly protective measure was actually facilitating the attacker's operational plan by preventing evacuation while concentrating high-value targets in easily controlled areas. The elevator lockdown forced building occupants to rely on emergency stairwells that could be monitored and controlled by small numbers of operators positioned at strategic choke points, a tactical advantage that turned the building's safety systems into instruments of containment. Fire suppression systems activated throughout the lower floors, filling the area with halon gas that reduced visibility, while creating breathing difficulties for anyone not equipped with proper respiratory protection. Sarah realized that the attackers were wearing gas masks integrated into their tactical equipment, allowing them to operate effectively in an environment that would debilitate civilian resistance and complicate any law enforcement response that attempted to retake the building through conventional assault tactics. Communication jamming intensified dramatically as the assault began, with cellular networks and radio frequencies being disrupted by equipment that created electromagnetic interference across a wide spectrum of commercial and emergency service bands. Sarah's attempts to contact building security or external emergency services confirmed that the attackers had achieved complete communication isolation, preventing coordination between potential defenders while ensuring that their own tactical communications remained secure through military-grade, frequency-hopping radios that civilian jamming couldn't affect. The attackers moved through the building with obvious familiarity with its layout, proceeding directly to critical infrastructure points without the hesitation or confusion that would characterize operators working from architectural drawings rather than actual reconnaissance. Sarah observed that they bypassed non-essential areas while securing control of elevators, stairwells, and communication nodes with the efficiency of a military unit executing a battle plan that had been refined through extensive preparation and simulation. Stairwell access points were systematically secured by operators who positioned themselves to control vertical movement while maintaining communication with the main assault force, creating multiple layers of tactical control that would prevent evacuation while ensuring that law enforcement response teams would face coordinated resistance at every level of the building. Sarah recognized this as standard doctrine for urban operations designed to maintain control of high-value targets while preventing external interference with the mission's primary objectives. Building management systems came under direct attack as operators gained physical access to control rooms that governed everything from climate control to fire suppression, demonstrating technical capabilities that suggested military engineering training rather than basic criminal skills. Sarah watched through security monitors that remained functional as these operators systematically disabled building systems that could interfere with their operation while maintaining others that would facilitate their control of the facility and its occupants. The main assault force proceeded directly toward the elevator banks that provided access to the executive floors, their movement patterns indicating detailed knowledge of building security protocols and the most efficient routes to reach high-value targets on the 42nd floor. Sarah realized that their tactical planning had accounted for the location of the shareholders' meeting and the concentration of valuable hostages that would provide maximum leverage for whatever political or financial objectives were driving this operation. Backup power systems activated as primary electrical service was disrupted, but the emergency generators were operating under the control of the attackers, who'd gained access to the building's central utility systems. Sarah noted that maintaining power to specific systems while disrupting others required technical knowledge that went far beyond basic sabotage, suggesting that this operation had been planned by professionals who understood how to exploit commercial building infrastructure for tactical advantages. External law enforcement response began materializing as patrol units responded to automatic alarms triggered by the explosion, but their initial approach suggested that they were treating this as a conventional emergency rather than a coordinated military assault. Sarah could see through the lobby windows that police officers were taking positions that would be appropriate for responding to criminal activity, but inadequate for engaging professionally trained military operators who'd established offensive positions and fields of fire that could devastate conventional law enforcement tactics. News helicopters appeared over the downtown area as media organizations responded to reports of explosions and emergency services activity, their presence ensuring that whatever happened next would receive maximum public attention while potentially providing intelligence to the attackers about law enforcement positioning and response capabilities. Sarah understood that media coverage was often an essential component of operations designed to achieve political objectives through spectacular violence that dominated news cycles and influenced public policy discussions. Federal agencies began mobilizing resources appropriate for terrorist incidents involving financial institutions, but their response times and tactical capabilities would be insufficient to prevent whatever the attackers planned to accomplish during the window of operational control they'd established through superior preparation and tactical surprise. Sarah realized that the attackers had calculated their timeline based on realistic assessments of federal response capabilities, ensuring they would have sufficient time to achieve their objectives before facing organized resistance from properly equipped and trained government forces. The shareholders, meeting on the 42nd floor, continued in apparent ignorance of the situation developing below them, with executives focused on quarterly earnings reports and strategic planning discussions that would become irrelevant if they didn't survive the next few hours. Sarah understood that the attackers' plan depended on maintaining the element of surprise until they'd achieved complete control of the building and its high-value occupants, preventing any organized resistance or evacuation that could complicate their tactical situation. Building automation systems that controlled access to secure areas began responding to commands that weren't coming from authorized personnel, indicating that the attackers had gained control of electronic security systems through either physical access to control systems or cyber capabilities that allowed remote manipulation of building infrastructure. Sarah noted that this level of system penetration required months of preparation and access to technical resources that suggested state-level rather than terrorist organization capabilities. Emergency response protocols designed for natural disasters and medical emergencies proved completely inadequate for dealing with a coordinated military assault that had overwhelmed building security and established tactical control of critical infrastructure systems. Sarah realized that civilian emergency planning had never seriously considered the possibility of professional military operations against commercial targets, creating vulnerabilities that sophisticated attackers could exploit to achieve objectives that would have been impossible against properly defended military installations. Climate control systems throughout the building shifted into configurations that would facilitate the deployment of chemical agents or create environmental conditions that favored the attackers' operational requirements while creating additional stress for building occupants who were already dealing with the psychological impact of being trapped in a facility under hostile control. Sarah recognized these environmental modifications as standard techniques for maintaining tactical advantages during extended operations in urban environments. Tactical communications between the assault team members became audible through building intercom systems that had been compromised and repurposed for operational coordination, revealing coordination patterns and objective priorities that confirmed Sarah's assessment that this was a professional military operation rather than criminal activity or terrorism motivated by ideological rather than strategic considerations. The communications discipline and tactical terminology being used indicated training and experience levels that would be found only among elite military units or private military contractors with access to advanced operational resources. As the situation stabilized into what was clearly a hostage scenario involving 300 of the most powerful people in American finance, Sarah found herself in the unique position of being the only person in the building who possessed both the training to understand the tactical situation and the potential capability to influence its outcome. Her position at the reception desk provided observation of the attacker's deployment, while her knowledge of building systems and layout gave her advantages that even the sophisticated operational planning of the assault team couldn't have anticipated. Moment had arrived when Sarah would have to choose between maintaining the civilian identity she'd carefully constructed over 3 years and reverting to the military capabilities that had made her one of the most effective snipers in special operations. Skills that could determine whether 300 innocent people survived the day or became casualties in an operation that would reshape American understanding of how vulnerable civilian infrastructure had become to military-style attacks by professionally trained operators with access to advanced tactical resources and intelligence capabilities. Time compressed into the crystalline clarity that Sarah remembered from sniper hides in the Hindu Kush, where split-second decisions determined whether missions succeeded or entire teams died in the mountains of Afghanistan. Her hands moved with muscle memory that had been forged through thousands of hours of training, reaching into the bottom drawer of her reception desk, where she'd hidden equipment that civilian employees weren't supposed to possess. Items that had seemed like paranoid preparation when she'd placed them there 3 years ago, but now represented the difference between helpless observation and tactical intervention. The compact rifle components had been disguised as office supplies and personal items, a breakdown configuration that could be assembled into a functional weapon system within 90 seconds by someone with the proper training and experience. Sarah's fingers found the pieces automatically, her mind already calculating assembly sequences while her eyes tracked the movement patterns of the assault team members, who'd taken positions throughout the lobby with the professional spacing of operators who understood fields of fire and mutual support concepts that kept military units alive in hostile territory. The primary tactical challenge was gaining access to an elevated position that would provide the sight lines necessary for precision engagement, while remaining concealed from operators who were trained to identify and neutralize sniper threats before they could become effective. Sarah's knowledge of the building's maintenance areas and service routes provided options that the attacker's reconnaissance couldn't have fully mapped, particularly the utility spaces between floors that were accessible through service panels. Disguised as decorative elements in the corporate architecture, building schematics that she'd memorized during routine facility coordination revealed a ventilation maintenance area on the 28th floor that would provide direct sight lines to the lobby through climate control openings that appeared to be standard architectural features but could accommodate precision rifle fire from someone with the training to exploit unconventional firing positions. The route to this position required movement through service corridors that bypassed the main circulation areas where the attackers had established observation posts and control points. Communication with potential friendly forces remained impossible due to the electronic jamming that isolated the building from external coordination. But Sarah understood that her tactical situation favored independent action rather than coordination with law enforcement agencies that lacked the training and equipment necessary to engage professional military operators in urban combat environments. Her mission parameters were clear: neutralize enough of the assault team to break their tactical coordination and create opportunities for civilian evacuation or law enforcement intervention. The assembled rifle system represented capabilities that exceeded anything available to civilian law enforcement agencies. Precision equipment that had been designed for military operations, where engagement ranges and accuracy requirements demanded performance standards that commercial sporting rifles couldn't achieve. Sarah's personal weapon had been modified with components that reflected years of combat experience and access to military armor or resources that weren't available through civilian channels, creating a system optimized for the kind of precision work that had made her reputation in special operations. Ammunition selection had been predetermined, based on tactical requirements for urban environments where over-penetration could create civilian casualties while under-penetration might fail. To neutralize threats wearing military-grade body armor, Sarah had chosen rounds specifically designed for precision engagement of armored targets in environments where collateral damage considerations required surgical accuracy rather than overwhelming firepower. Ammunition that would deliver immediate incapacitation while minimizing risk to innocent personnel in adjacent areas. The movement to her firing position required crossing areas that were under intermittent observation by assault team members, but Sarah's understanding of their tactical deployment and timing patterns allowed her to exploit brief windows when their attention was focused on securing control points or coordinating with team members in other areas of the building. Her movement techniques reflected training in urban evasion and concealment that had been developed for operations in populated areas, where detection meant mission failure and probable death. Service corridors provided concealment, but also channeled movement in ways that could become fatal funnels if the attackers detected her presence and responded with the kind of systematic clearance procedures that military units use to eliminate threats in confined spaces. Sarah moved with the methodical patience of someone who understood that speed was less important than remaining undetected, using techniques that had been refined through operations where entire missions depended on remaining invisible to enemy forces who were actively searching for exactly the kind of threat she represented. The 28th floor maintenance area was accessed through a service panel that required tools disguised as office supplies, equipment that had seemed like excessive preparation when she'd placed it in her desk drawer, but now provided access to tactical positions that could determine the outcome of an operation involving 300 innocent lives. Sarah's entry into the maintenance area triggered no alarms because her access codes remained valid and her knowledge of building systems allowed her to disable monitoring devices without creating alerts that would reveal her position to attackers who'd compromised the building's security networks. Ventilation systems provided both concealment and firing positions, but they also created acoustic challenges that could compromise her position if the sound of her shots carried through ductwork to areas where assault team members could triangulate her location and respond with concentrated fire that would eliminate her tactical advantage. Sarah positioned sound-dampening materials that she'd prepared for exactly this contingency, items that appeared to be routine maintenance supplies but were actually military-grade acoustic suppression equipment. The firing position provided direct sight lines to the lobby where assault team members had established positions that controlled access to the elevators and stairwells, their deployment patterns revealing tactical priorities that focused on preventing evacuation while maintaining communication with team elements positioned throughout the building. Sarah's elevated position allowed her to observe coordination patterns and communication procedures that would determine the sequence of her engagement plan, targeting priorities based on tactical importance rather than target availability. Range estimation confirmed distances that were well within her effective engagement envelope, environmental conditions that favored precision, shooting with minimal wind drift or atmospheric interference that could affect bullet trajectory over the relatively short ranges involved in building-to-building engagements. Sarah's calculation of environmental factors reflected training that had made her effective at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters in combat environments where atmospheric conditions and target movement patterns created challenges that didn't exist in the controlled environment of a commercial building. Target assessment revealed body armor configurations that would require precise shot placement to achieve immediate incapacitation, professional equipment that provided protection against most civilian law enforcement ammunition but remained vulnerable to military precision rifle systems when employed by operators with the training to exploit the technical limitations of personal protective equipment. Sarah's knowledge of ballistic protection systems reflected experience with various types of body armor encountered during overseas operations, where enemy forces had access to military-grade protective equipment. The first engagement priority was the assault team leader, whose position in the lobby provided him with tactical control over the entire operation. Communication equipment that allowed coordination with team elements throughout the building and oversight of activities that could determine whether the hostage situation remained stable or escalated into mass casualties. Sarah identified this target through observation of command and control patterns that reflected military leadership structures and communication protocols that she recognized from her own operational experience, breathing control, and natural respiratory pause techniques that had been drilled into muscle memory during sniper training allowed Sarah to achieve the physiological stability necessary for precision shooting under stress conditions that would degrade accuracy for operators without extensive combat experience. Her heart rate remained controlled despite the adrenaline flood that accompanied tactical engagement, training that had been reinforced through countless hours of practice under simulated combat stress that replicated the psychological pressure of actual operations. Sight picture acquisition confirmed optimal conditions for precision engagement, environmental factors and equipment performance that created the ideal circumstances for achieving surgical accuracy at ranges where even minor errors in shot placement could result in tactical failure and probable discovery by remaining assault team members. Sarah's sight alignment reflected years of training that had made precision shooting automatic rather than conscious. Muscle memory that functioned effectively even under the extreme stress of combat operations. The mental transition from civilian receptionist to military sniper occurred with the completeness that had characterized her previous operational deployments. Personality and perspective shifts that allowed her to function effectively in combat environments while maintaining the tactical judgment necessary to distinguish between legitimate targets and innocent personnel who might be in proximity to hostile forces. Her rules of engagement were clear: eliminate threats to civilian safety, while minimizing risk to building occupants who were trapped in a situation beyond their control or understanding. Tactical patience that had been developed through operations where premature action could compromise entire missions allowed Sarah to wait for optimal engagement opportunities, rather than taking shots that might achieve tactical results, while alerting remaining assault team members to the presence of a sniper threat that could change their operational planning and force them to accelerate their timeline for achieving whatever objectives had motivated this complex and sophisticated operation. Target movement patterns revealed coordination sequences that would allow Sarah to engage multiple targets in rapid succession. If she could exploit the brief windows when assault team members were focused on specific tasks rather than maintaining general situational awareness that would allow them to detect muzzle flash or other indicators of sniper activity. Her engagement plan required perfect timing and execution because any deviation from optimal shot placement or sequence could result in tactical failure with consequences that would affect hundreds of innocent lives. The scope's crosshairs settled on the first target with the steady precision that had made Sarah effective in combat environments where single shots determined mission success or failure, where the difference between perfect accuracy and near misses was measured in human lives, rather than scoring points on paper targets. Her finger found the trigger with the gentle pressure that had been practiced until it became automatic. The final moment before tactical theory became lethal reality and 3 years of civilian anonymity ended in professional violence that would determine whether 300 innocent people lived or died in the next few minutes. The rifle spoke with the subdued authority of precision engineering, its suppressed report no louder than a book dropping on marble floor. But the effect on the assault team leader was immediate and devastating. Sarah watched through her scope as the 308 round found its target with surgical accuracy, striking the gap between body armor plates with the kind of precision that ended threats instantly while confirming to every operator in the lobby that they were facing a sniper with professional military training rather than civilian resistance or law enforcement intervention. The tactical situation transformed immediately from controlled hostage operation to active combat engagement as the remaining assault team members reacted with the disciplined coordination of professionals who understood that sniper threats required immediate counteraction to prevent systematic elimination of their operational capability. Sarah observed their movement patterns through her scope, noting how they shifted from static defensive positions to dynamic tactical displacement that would make subsequent engagements more challenging while demonstrating training levels that exceeded most military units she'd encountered during overseas deployments. Her second shot eliminated the communications operator, whose equipment provided coordination with assault teams positioned throughout the building, the round striking with the same clinical precision that had characterized her first engagement, while creating tactical isolation that would prevent the remaining lobby team from coordinating effectively with operators on other floors. Sarah's target selection reflected an understanding of military command structure and the critical personnel whose elimination would create maximum degradation of enemy operational capability while minimizing her own exposure to counter-sniper fire. The assault team's response revealed tactical sophistication that confirmed Sarah's assessment of their professional military backgrounds. Immediate deployment of smoke grenades that obscured sightlines, while team members bounded to positions that would complicate precision engagement from her current firing position. Their smoke deployment patterns demonstrated understanding of sniper tactics and counter-sniper procedures that would be found only among elite military units or private military contractors with access to advanced tactical training and operational experience. Movement to an alternate firing position became necessary as the assault team began systematic suppression of potential sniper locations, their fire discipline and target selection indicating training in urban combat environments, where sniper threats were expected and countered through proven tactical procedures. Sarah displaced through ventilation systems and maintenance areas with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd planned multiple contingency positions. Her movement concealed by building infrastructure that provided protection from return fire while maintaining access to engagement opportunities. Building systems continued functioning under the control of assault team members who'd gained access to central utility controls. But Sarah's knowledge of backup systems and manual overrides allowed her to manipulate environmental conditions in ways that would favor her tactical situation, while creating additional challenges for operators who were now dealing with an active sniper threat in addition to their original mission objectives. Her manipulation of building infrastructure reflected training in unconventional warfare techniques that exploited civilian systems for military advantages. The third engagement eliminated the assault team's demolition specialist whose equipment posed the greatest threat to civilian hostages. If the tactical situation deteriorated into a siege scenario where the operators might choose to eliminate witnesses rather than risk capture and prosecution for what was clearly a sophisticated international operation rather than domestic terrorism or criminal activity. Sarah's shot placement reflected understanding of explosive ordnance and the catastrophic consequences that could result from uncontrolled detonation of military-grade demolitions in a commercial building filled with innocent people. Law enforcement response outside the building intensified as patrol units were reinforced by tactical teams and federal agencies, but their positioning and equipment revealed that they were still treating this as a conventional hostage situation rather than a military operation conducted by professionals with capabilities that exceeded most civilian law enforcement tactical units. Sarah could observe through building windows that police commanders were establishing perimeters and negotiation procedures that would be ineffective against operators who'd planned for extended siege scenarios and possessed both the training and equipment necessary to maintain tactical control despite external pressure. Communication intercepts Through building intercom systems revealed that the assault teams positioned on upper floors were proceeding with their primary mission objectives. Despite the tactical complications created by sniper interference, their operational discipline, suggesting that they'd anticipated potential resistance and developed contingency plans that would allow mission completion even under adverse circumstances. Sarah realized that her tactical intervention had disrupted their timeline, but hadn't prevented them from maintaining control of the high-value hostages whose capture represented the core objective of this sophisticated operation. The fourth engagement targeted the assault team's designated marksman whose precision rifle posed a direct threat to Sarah's continued effectiveness, her shot striking before he could establish a stable firing position that would have allowed him to engage her location. With the kind of precision fire that could penetrate her concealment and eliminate her tactical advantage. The engagement required perfect timing and shot placement, because missing would have revealed her position to an operator with the training and equipment necessary to neutralize sniper threats through accurate return fire. Smoke cleared from the lobby area to reveal tactical repositioning that demonstrated the assault team's adaptation to sniper interference. Their new positions providing mutual support and overlapping fields of fire that would complicate further precision engagement, while maintaining control of critical access points that prevented civilian evacuation or law enforcement intervention. Sarah noted that their tactical adjustments reflected training in counter-sniper operations and understanding of how professional military units adapted to unexpected threats during active operations. Emergency services response revealed coordination challenges between different agencies and jurisdictions, communication difficulties that were being exploited by the assault teams to maintain tactical initiative while preventing effective law enforcement response to an operation that exceeded the training and equipment capabilities of civilian police departments. Sarah understood that federal agencies with appropriate tactical capabilities were mobilizing resources that could effectively engage professional military operators, but their response times provided the assault teams with operational windows that could allow mission completion before effective resistance materialized. Building automation systems began responding to manual overrides that Sarah activated through maintenance access panels, environmental modifications that created tactical advantages, while demonstrating her intimate knowledge of building infrastructure that the assault teams' reconnaissance hadn't fully mapped. Her manipulation of climate control and lighting systems reflected training in unconventional warfare techniques that exploited civilian infrastructure for military purposes, capabilities that allowed her to influence the tactical environment. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned by professional operators, the fifth engagement eliminated an assault team member who was attempting to establish overwatch positions that would provide observation of potential sniper locations. Sarah's shot preventing him from gaining tactical advantage that could have compromised her operational effectiveness while revealing the locations of her alternate firing positions. Her target selection continued to reflect understanding of military tactics and the critical personnel whose elimination would create maximum degradation of enemy operational capability. Hostage communications from the 42nd floor conference room indicated that the assault teams positioned there were proceeding with interrogation procedures designed to extract information about financial systems and corporate decision-making processes, their activities suggesting that this operation involved industrial espionage or economic warfare rather than simple kidnapping or terrorist intimidation. Sarah realized that the sophistication of the operation and the specific targeting of high-value financial executives indicated state-level involvement rather than criminal or terrorist motivations. Tactical ammunition management required careful consideration of remaining rounds and the need to maintain engagement capability for extended operations. Sarah's combat load having been determined based on normal civilian security threats rather than sustained combat against professional military operators. Her ammunition selection and load planning reflected preparation for defensive scenarios, rather than the kind of extended engagement that was developing as the assault teams adapted their tactical procedures to account for active sniper interference, counter-sniper. Procedures employed by the remaining assault team members demonstrated training in urban warfare environments where sniper threats were expected and countered through systematic area denial and suppression techniques that would eventually locate and eliminate her firing positions if she remained static. Rather than continuing to exploit her knowledge of building infrastructure for tactical mobility, Sarah's survival depended on maintaining movement and exploiting firing positions that the assault teams couldn't effectively suppress or assault. Federal tactical teams began establishing positions outside the building that suggested preparation for direct assault operations, their equipment and deployment patterns indicating capabilities that could effectively engage professional military operators if they could gain access to the building without triggering execution of hostages or detonation of explosive devices that the assault teams had positioned to prevent exactly this kind of law enforcement intervention. Sarah understood that her tactical situation was evolving from independent sniper operations to potential coordination with federal assault teams. The sixth engagement targeted the assault team member responsible for monitoring emergency access routes, his elimination creating gaps in their perimeter security that could potentially allow civilian evacuation or provide access routes for law enforcement tactical teams attempting to enter the building. Sarah's shot placement continued to reflect understanding of military tactical principles and the critical positions whose compromise would create maximum operational disadvantage for enemy forces while providing tactical opportunities for friendly forces. Building security systems that remained under assault team control began responding to countermeasures that Sarah implemented through manual overrides and backup systems, her actions creating environmental conditions that favored precision engagement, while complicating the tactical situation for operators who were now dealing with lighting conditions and environmental factors that hadn't been part of their original operational planning. Her knowledge of building infrastructure provided advantages that compensated for being outnumbered and outgunned by professional military operators. Psychological pressure on the remaining assault team members became evident through their tactical communications and movement patterns, the systematic elimination of their team members, creating stress that affected decision-making and operational effectiveness. Despite their professional training and combat experience, Sarah recognized that sustained sniper pressure could degrade enemy morale and tactical coordination even among elite military units. Psychological warfare principles that she'd seen applied during overseas operations were persistent threats, created cumulative stress that affected operational performance. The tactical situation continued evolving as remaining assault team members adapted their procedures to account for active sniper interference while attempting to maintain control of their primary objectives, their operational discipline, and tactical flexibility, demonstrating training levels that confirmed Sarah's assessment of their professional military backgrounds and access to advanced tactical resources and operational support that exceeded most civilian law enforcement capabilities. The final assault team member in the lobby made the fatal mistake of breaking cover to retrieve communication equipment from his eliminated team leader, exposing himself to precision fire for the 3 seconds that Sarah needed to end the ground floor threat permanently. Her 7th shot struck with the same clinical accuracy that had characterized every previous engagement, the .308 round, finding its target despite the tactical gear and body armor that had provided protection against conventional law enforcement ammunition but remained vulnerable to military precision rifle systems employed by operators with elite-level marksmanship training. Federal tactical teams outside the building began coordinating entry procedures through windows that Sarah had systematically compromised by manipulating building environmental systems, their breach preparations indicating understanding that The lobby area had been cleared of hostile forces through sniper intervention rather than conventional assault tactics. Sarah observed through building security monitors that remained functional as heavily armed federal agents prepared to engage. Assault teams on upper floors with equipment and training, appropriate for combating professional military operators rather than civilian criminals or domestic terrorists. The tactical situation on floors above the lobby remained fluid as assault teams, positioned there, continued their primary mission operations while adapting to communication disruptions caused by the elimination of their ground floor coordination element. Their operational discipline suggesting contingency planning that allowed mission continuation, despite tactical setbacks that would have caused most military units to abort operations and extract under covering fire. Sarah realized that these operators possessed both the training and motivation necessary to complete their objectives, regardless of casualties or external pressure from law enforcement agencies. Building automation systems responded to Sarah's continued manipulation of environmental controls, creating atmospheric conditions that would complicate the assault team's use of chemical agents, while providing tactical advantages for federal forces attempting to establish footholds in the Kodhim. Building through conventional assault procedures. Her knowledge of commercial building infrastructure allowed her to exploit systems that the assault team's operational planning hadn't fully considered. Civilian technology that could be weaponized through understanding of mechanical and electronic integration principles that weren't typically addressed in military tactical training. Communication with federal tactical commanders became possible as Sarah accessed building intercom systems that had been partially restored through manual overrides, allowing her to provide intelligence about assault team capabilities and positioning that would prevent federal agents from walking into tactical situations that could result in significant casualties among law enforcement personnel who lacked experience with combating elite military operators in urban environments. Her tactical briefing reflected understanding of both civilian law enforcement capabilities and military operational procedures that would be essential for successful coordination between different types of tactical units. Hostage communications from the executive conference room indicated that assault teams positioned there were accelerating their interrogation procedures and data extraction operations, their activities suggesting awareness that their tactical timeline was being compressed by external pressure and internal resistance that hadn't been anticipated during their operational planning phase. Sarah understood that the assault teams would likely attempt to complete their primary objectives and extract within the next hour, using procedures that might involve eliminating witnesses to prevent identification and prosecution of what was clearly an international operation with state-level sponsorship. The 8th engagement eliminated an assault team member who was attempting to establish communications with external extraction assets. Sarah's shot preventing coordination between building-based operators and support elements that were positioned to facilitate rapid departure from the operational area once primary objectives had been achieved. Her target selection reflected understanding of military extraction procedures and the critical communication links that allowed coordinated withdrawal under pressure from pursuing law enforcement and military forces. Ammunition status required careful management as Sarah's combat load approached depletion, her remaining rounds representing the difference between continued tactical effectiveness and potential capture or elimination by assault team members who were adapting their counter-sniper procedures to account for her systematic elimination of their operational capability. Her ammunition conservation reflected training in sustained combat operations, where resupply wasn't available and tactical effectiveness depended on precise shot placement rather than volume of fire. Federal coordination revealed deployment of specialized tactical units with capabilities specifically designed for engaging professional military operators in urban environments. Their equipment and procedures indicating understanding that this operation exceeded the scope of conventional law enforcement response and required military-level tactical intervention to achieve successful resolution without catastrophic civilian casualties. Sarah observed through building security systems as these specialized units, established positions that would allow coordinated assault operations designed to overwhelm remaining hostile forces through superior firepower and tactical coordination. Building structural integrity remained stable, despite the explosive charges that had been detonated during the initial assault. But Sarah's knowledge of commercial construction revealed potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited if the assault teams chose to create diversions or escape routes through controlled demolition of specific structural elements. Her assessment of building engineering provided tactical intelligence that would be valuable for federal commanders, planning assault operations that required understanding of how the building would respond to various types of damage or modification. The 9th engagement targeted an assault team member who was positioning explosive charges near structural support columns, his elimination preventing potential collapse scenarios that could have resulted in catastrophic civilian casualties, while creating tactical diversions that would have complicated federal assault operations. Sarah's shot placement reflected understanding of demolitions procedures and the critical timing sequences that determined whether controlled explosions achieved tactical objectives or created uncontrolled destruction that could affect the entire building structure. Psychological warfare aspects of the operation became apparent as news media coverage intensified outside the building. The assault team's tactical procedures, suggesting that maximum publicity was part of their operational objectives rather than an unwanted complication that needed to be minimized through operational security measures. Sarah realized that this operation was designed to demonstrate vulnerabilities in American financial infrastructure and corporate security protocols, achieving strategic objectives through psychological impact rather than simple financial gain or political intimidation. Federal assault teams began coordinated entry operations through multiple access points that had been prepared by Sarah's manipulation of building security systems. Their tactical procedures indicating training urban warfare environments where professional military operators could be expected to employ sophisticated defensive measures and booby trap installations designed to maximize casualties among attacking forces. The federal tactical response demonstrated understanding that this operation required military-level intervention rather than conventional law enforcement procedures. Tactical coordination between Sarah's sniper operations and federal assault teams required real-time intelligence sharing about assault team positions and capabilities. Her knowledge of enemy tactical procedures, providing crucial information that would prevent federal agents from walking into prepared ambush positions or explosive devices that could cause significant casualties among law enforcement personnel. Her tactical briefing reflected years of experience with military operations and understanding of how professional military units employed defensive tactics in urban environments. The 10th engagement eliminated the assault team's intelligence specialist whose equipment contained data extraction capabilities that could have compromised sensitive financial information affecting millions of civilian accounts and retirement funds. Sarah's shot preventing economic warfare objectives that could have had strategic consequences extending far beyond the immediate hostage situation. Her target selection reflected an understanding of intelligence operations and the critical personnel whose elimination would prevent successful completion of economic espionage objectives that could affect national financial security. Building environmental systems continued responding to Sarah's control inputs as she created tactical conditions that favored federal assault operations while complicating the remaining assault teams' ability to maintain defensive positions or execute their extraction procedures. Her manipulation of civilian infrastructure demonstrating unconventional warfare capabilities that compensated for numerical disadvantage against professional military operators. Her knowledge of building automation provided tactical advantages that hadn't been anticipated by assault teams. whose operational planning had focused on conventional security threats rather than military-level resistance. Federal tactical teams reported successful breaching operations on multiple floors as they engaged remaining assault team members with equipment and procedures appropriate for combating elite military operators. Their tactical communications indicating that Sarah's sniper intervention had created sufficient tactical disruption to allow law enforcement forces to gain footholds that would have been impossible against intact assault teams with full operational capability and coordination. The federal assault demonstrated training and equipment levels that confirmed government understanding of the military nature of this operation. Hostage extraction procedures began as federal teams established control of the executive conference room, their tactical communications confirming that all 300 corporate executives had survived the operation, despite being held under threat of execution for several hours while assault teams conducted interrogation and data extraction. Operations designed to compromise American financial security systems. Sarah observed through building security monitors as federal agents began systematic evacuation of hostages who had witnessed an operation that would reshape their understanding of corporate vulnerability to state-sponsored military attacks. The final engagement eliminated the assault team leader, who had maintained tactical control of upper floor operations despite communication disruptions and systematic elimination of his subordinate personnel. Sarah's shot ending organized resistance and allowing federal tactical teams to secure the building without further casualties among law enforcement personnel or civilian hostages. Her precision fire had achieved tactical objectives that prevented successful completion of what was clearly an international operation designed to demonstrate American vulnerability to economic warfare, conducted through military means. Ammunition depletion marked the end of Sarah's active tactical involvement as federal teams assumed responsibility for building security and continued operations against any remaining hostile personnel. Her sniper intervention having achieved the critical objective of disrupting assault team coordination and creating tactical opportunities that allowed law enforcement forces to regain control of the situation. Her transition from civilian receptionist to military sniper had prevented what could have been a catastrophic demonstration of American financial infrastructure vulnerability to coordinated military assault by professionally trained international operators. Building security systems gradually returned to normal operation as federal technicians restored communication networks and environmental controls that had been compromised during the assault. Their technical assessment revealing the sophistication of the operation and the extensive preparation that had been required to achieve the level of tactical coordination and system penetration that characterized this attack. The technical capabilities demonstrated by the assault teams confirmed that this operation had been sponsored and supported by foreign intelligence services with access to advanced military resources and operational planning capabilities. Federal debriefing procedures began immediately as Sarah's role in preventing the operation's success became apparent to tactical commanders who understood that civilian casualties would have been catastrophic without sniper intervention that had systematically eliminated assault team capabilities and created tactical opportunities for law enforcement response. Her transition back to civilian identity would prove impossible as her military capabilities and tactical effectiveness became part of the official record of an operation that would influence American security policy and corporate protection protocols for years to come. The shareholders' meeting that had been interrupted by the assault eventually resumed in a secure federal facility. Corporate executives making decisions about financial strategies and market positions while struggling to comprehend how close they had come to becoming casualties in an international operation designed to demonstrate that American financial power remained vulnerable to military force applied by adversaries with sufficient resources and tactical sophistication to challenge The assumptions of safety that had characterized civilian corporate culture since the end of the Cold War. 6 months after the Meridian Tower incident, Sarah Chen stood before a congressional committee. In a closed session, her testimony classified at levels that most senators had never seen. The official story spoke of a foiled robbery attempt, but those who needed to know understood that America had faced its first test of economic warfare conducted through military means. Sarah's intervention had prevented not just mass casualties, but the theft of financial algorithms that could have destabilized global markets. The quiet receptionist who'd arranged flowers and scheduled meetings had become something she'd never wanted to be again: visible. Corporate security consulting firms offered her millions. Military contractors promised executive positions. Foreign governments made inquiries through diplomatic channels that suggested her reputation had traveled far beyond American borders. Sarah made a different choice. Today, she teaches advanced tactical courses to federal agents and corporate security teams, sharing knowledge that transforms assumptions about civilian vulnerability. Her students include CEOs who'd sat in that conference room, executives who now understand that their wealth means nothing when professionals decide to take it. She shows them that the greatest security isn't technology or guards, but people who choose to stand between predators and prey. The classroom where she lectures overlooks downtown Phoenix, Meridian Tower visible through windows that now display memorial plaques honoring the agents who died securing the building. Sarah's students don't know that their instructor once prevented an international incident with 11 precisely placed shots, or that her transition from warrior to teacher represents the most important mission of her career. Have you ever wondered who might be watching over you without you knowing it? Drop a comment about the hidden heroes in your own community, the people whose stories deserve to be told. Hit that subscribe button for more incredible stories about ordinary people with extraordinary secrets, and ring the notification bell so you never miss these powerful tales of courage and sacrifice. Share this video with someone who needs to. Remember that heroes walk among us every single day, often invisible until the moment the world needs them most. She was just a receptionist at the Meridian Corporate Tower, a woman with perfectly manicured nails who answered phones with a voice like honey and scheduled meetings with the efficiency of someone who'd never missed a deadline in her life. Sarah Chen looked like every other polished professional you'd see in a downtown office building, her tailored blazers hiding shoulders that had once steadied a rifle scope across desert mountains, her gentle smile masking eyes that had calculated wind speed and bullet drop with deadly precision. But when the armed militia stormed through the glass lobby doors during the annual shareholders conference with 300 executives trapped on the 42nd floor, everyone froze except Sarah, and in the next 4 hours this quiet woman, with the flower arrangements on her desk, would remind the world that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one nobody sees coming. The morning had started like every other Wednesday in downtown Phoenix, with Sarah Chen arriving at Meridian Corporate Tower at exactly 7:15, her coffee still steaming and her leather portfolio tucked neatly under her arm. She moved through the marble lobby with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned long ago that being unremarkable was often the most valuable skill you could possess. The security guards nodded their usual greeting. The cleaning crew waved from behind their industrial vacuum cleaners, and the early arriving executives barely glanced in her direction as they hurried toward the elevator banks. Sarah had worked the front desk at Meridian Financial for 3 years now, ever since she'd hung up her military uniform and decided that civilian life meant finding a job where the biggest crisis would be a double-booked conference room or a malfunctioning coffee machine. She was good at it too, the kind of receptionist who remembered everyone's names, knew which executives took their coffee black and which ones needed their calls screened, who could handle a room full of angry investors with the same calm professionalism she'd once used to talk fighter pilots through emergency landings over hostile territory. The tower itself was a monument to modern corporate architecture. 45 floors of steel and glass that reflected the Arizona sun like a beacon visible from anywhere in the valley. Meridian Financial occupied floors 38 through 45, with the executive offices and boardroom taking up the top floor, where the company's most important decisions were made behind walls of reinforced glass that offered panoramic views of the desert stretching to the horizon. It was the kind of building that made statements about power and success, where million-dollar deals were negotiated over lunch, and where the wrong decision could cost thousands of jobs across 3 states. Sarah's desk sat in the center of the 38th floor lobby, positioned so she could see everyone coming and going, could monitor the elevator banks and the emergency stairwells with the kind of situational awareness that most people never developed because they'd never needed to stay alive in places where everyone wanted to kill them. Her computer held schedules for 12 senior executives. Her phone system connected her to every department in the building, and her security clearance gave her access to floors that most employees never saw. She was, in many ways, the nerve center of the entire operation, the person who knew where everyone was supposed to be at any given moment. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled to begin at 9:30, with executives flying in from Los Angeles, Seattle, and New York to discuss the quarterly earnings that would determine whether Meridian Financial continued its expansion into international markets or started making the kind of cuts that turned corporate news into human tragedy. 300 of the most powerful people in the financial industry would be packed into the 42nd floor conference center, making decisions that would ripple through the economy like stones thrown into still water. Sarah had spent the previous week coordinating arrivals, booking hotel rooms, arranging transportation, and making sure that every detail was perfect, because these were the kind of people who noticed when things went wrong and had the power to make sure someone paid for those mistakes. She'd worked with caterers to plan the lunch menu, coordinated with building security to handle the increased traffic, and personally checked every conference room to make sure the audiovisual equipment was functioning properly. It was the kind of event that could make or break careers, where fortunes were won and lost based on presentations that had been rehearsed for months. But as Sarah settled into her chair that morning and began her usual routine of checking emails and confirming appointments, she felt something nagging at the edge of her consciousness. The same instinct that had kept her alive during 3 tours in Afghanistan, when her job had been to lie motionless for hours at a time, watching enemy positions through a scope that could put a bullet through a playing card at 800 meters. It was the feeling that came when something wasn't quite right, when the normal pattern of things had been disturbed in ways too subtle for most people to notice. The first sign had come the previous afternoon when she'd noticed the same dark SUV parked across the street for the 3rd consecutive day, its occupants sitting too still in the front seats, their posture suggesting the kind of alertness that came from military training. Sarah had made note of the license plate, running it through databases she wasn't supposed to have access to anymore, discovering that the vehicle had been purchased with cash 2 weeks earlier by a company that existed only on paper. It was the kind of detail that civilian security would dismiss as coincidence, but Sarah had learned in the mountains of Kandahar that coincidences were usually just patterns you hadn't recognized yet. The second sign had been the unusual number of service calls to the building's communication systems, technicians who arrived with proper credentials but whose work seemed to involve more observation than actual repairs. Sarah had watched them from her desk, noting the way they positioned themselves to monitor elevator traffic and the way their eyes tracked the movements of security personnel. They moved like soldiers trying to look like civilians, with the kind of controlled alertness that suggested they were gathering intelligence rather than fixing fiber optic cables. The third sign had been the sudden increase in background checks requested by building security, routine inquiries that nonetheless suggested someone was very interested in the building's occupancy and security protocols. Sarah had processed several of these requests herself, noting that they focused specifically on the upper floors where the executives worked and the emergency procedures that would be implemented in the event of a crisis. It was the kind of information that someone planning an operation would need, the details that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. As the morning progressed and executives began arriving for the shareholders' meeting, Sarah found herself cataloging faces with the systematic attention she'd once used to identify enemy combatants in hostile territory. She noticed the way certain individuals moved through the lobby, their paths taking them past security checkpoints and emergency exits with the kind of casual precision that suggested prior reconnaissance. She observed the subtle hand signals exchanged between men who pretended not to know each other, the way they positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the building's public areas. By 8:45, Sarah's instincts were screaming, warnings that her conscious mind was still trying to rationalize away. She'd spent too many years learning to trust those instincts, had seen too many good soldiers die, because they'd ignored the subtle signals that preceded enemy action. The pattern was becoming clear now. The pieces of intelligence she'd been unconsciously gathering over the past week, suddenly forming a picture that made her blood run cold. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled to begin in 45 minutes. With 300 of the most powerful people in the financial industry gathering in a conference room that had been designed for prestige rather than security. The building's emergency protocols were adequate for fires and earthquakes, but had never been tested against the kind of coordinated assault that Sarah was beginning to suspect was imminent. The security staff were competent professionals, but they were trained to handle corporate espionage and white-collar crime, not military-style operations planned and executed by people who understood tactics and timing. Sarah's hands moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency, accessing building schematics and security protocols with clearances she'd maintained through contacts in the intelligence community who understood that some skills were too valuable to waste on civilian anonymity. She mapped exit routes and defensive positions, identified potential choke points and fields of fire, began formulating contingency plans with the kind of strategic thinking that had once made her one of the most effective snipers in special operations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent 3 years hiding from exactly this kind of situation, burying her military identity beneath layers of corporate normalcy, because she'd thought she was done with violence and death and the weight of making split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. She'd chosen the receptionist job specifically because it seemed safe, predictable, the kind of work where the biggest crisis would be a scheduling conflict or a malfunctioning printer. But as she watched the final pieces of what was obviously a carefully planned operation falling into place around her, Sarah realized that sometimes fate had other plans for the skills you thought you'd left behind. The elevator chimed softly. As the last group of executives arrived for the meeting, their laughter and conversation carrying across the lobby, as they disappeared into the cars that would carry them to the 42nd floor. Sarah watched them go with the sick certainty that many of those faces would not be laughing in an hour, that the comfortable world of corporate power and financial privilege was about to collide with the harsh realities of violence that she'd hoped never to see again. But as her grandfather had taught her during those long afternoons on his ranch in Montana, sometimes the choice isn't whether to fight, but whether to run or stand your ground when the fighting comes to you. The 38th floor of Meridian corporate tower operated with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine, and Sarah Chen had become an invisible but essential part of that machinery. At precisely 8:15 each morning, she would unlock her desk drawers with movements so practiced they seemed automatic, power up her computer systems, and begin the careful orchestration of another day in corporate America. Her workspace was a study in controlled organization, with family photos strategically positioned to suggest the kind of normal personal life that made executives comfortable, though the smiling faces in those frames belonged to army buddies rather than relatives. And the scenic vacation shots had been taken during leave time between deployments, rather than peaceful civilian holidays. The morning routine never varied because Sarah had learned long ago that consistency was camouflage, that people stopped noticing things that happened the same way every day. She would water the small succulent garden that lined her desk, plants chosen specifically because they could survive the kinds of neglect that came with extended absences, though none of her colleagues suspected that her green thumb had been developed in military bases where growing anything alive felt like victory against the desert. Her coffee mug bore the logo of Arizona State University, a detail that reinforced her carefully constructed backstory as a local girl who'd worked her way through business school, rather than the truth of a woman who'd earned her degree through the GI Bill after completing sniper training at Fort Benning. The executives who passed her desk each morning had grown comfortable with her presence in the way that powerful people become comfortable with efficient servants. They would nod politely while discussing mergers and acquisitions, never lowering their voices because a receptionist wasn't important enough to worry about, never realizing that the woman arranging their flowers had once sat in briefing rooms where the wrong information could start wars. Sarah had perfect recall for conversations, a skill that had made her valuable in intelligence-gathering operations, where remembering the placement of a single guard could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But she used it now to track office politics and scheduling conflicts with the same methodical attention to detail. Marcus Webb, the senior vice president who supervised her department, treated Sarah with the kind of distant professionalism that suggested he saw her as a particularly efficient piece of office equipment. He was a tall man with silver hair and expensive suits who spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to having his words carry weight in boardrooms across the country. Webb had been with Meridian Financial for 15 years, rising through the ranks with the kind of steady competence that built careers in corporate America, and he managed his department with an attention to detail that reminded Sarah of the better officer she'd served under. Though his battles were fought with spreadsheets rather than rifles, each morning Webb would stop by Sarah's desk to review the day's schedule, his questions precise and his expectations clear. He wanted to know who was arriving when, which meetings required special accommodations, which executives needed their calls screened because they were dealing with sensitive negotiations. Sarah provided these details with the kind of professional efficiency that made her indispensable, never revealing that she was simultaneously conducting her own intelligence-gathering operation, cataloging the movements and habits of everyone in the building with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to identify threats before they materialized. Jennifer Rodriguez worked in accounting on the 39th floor, and she had developed the habit of stopping by Sarah's desk each morning to share gossip and coffee, treating the receptionist as a confidant in the way that people often did with service workers they assumed were safely outside their professional circles. Jennifer was younger than Sarah, probably in her late 20s, with the kind of enthusiasm that came from believing that hard work and dedication would inevitably lead to advancement in the corporate hierarchy. She spoke freely about office relationships and interdepartmental tensions, never suspecting that Sarah was filing away every detail about security protocols and personnel schedules with the kind of attention that intelligence analysts devoted to enemy capabilities assessments. The conversations with Jennifer had proven unexpectedly valuable for understanding the building's internal dynamics, particularly the relationships between security personnel and the private contractors who handled sensitive executive protection during high-profile events like the shareholders meeting. Jennifer mentioned things casually, details about which guards worked which shifts, which executives required additional security screening, which floors had been swept for surveillance equipment in preparation for the meeting. Sarah absorbed this information while appearing to focus on flower arrangements and appointment scheduling, her mind automatically cross-referencing these details with the observations she'd been making about unusual activity in and around the Building. Dr. Patricia Manning worked for the consulting firm that occupied floors 28 through 32, and she had the habit of arriving early enough to avoid the elevator crowds, often stopping to chat with Sarah while waiting for her building access card to activate. Manning was in her 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that came from years of analyzing complex problems for Fortune 500 companies, and she spoke with the casual authority of someone who was used to being the smartest person in most rooms. She often discussed her work in general terms, describing the kinds of security assessments and risk analyses that her firm provided to corporations concerned about everything from cyber attacks to workplace violence. These conversations had given Sarah insights into the building's official security posture, particularly the assessments that had been conducted following several high-profile corporate attacks in other cities. Manning mentioned that Meridian Financial had been rated as having adequate security for normal operations, but significant vulnerabilities in the event of a coordinated assault, particularly on the upper floors where the executive offices were located. The building's emergency protocols had been designed primarily for natural disasters and medical emergencies, with evacuation procedures that assumed cooperation from attackers rather than active hostility. The facilities management team treated Sarah as an unofficial liaison for executive floor issues, often consulting with her about maintenance schedules and service requests because she maintained the calendar that determined when executives would be in their offices. Tom Harrison, the facility supervisor, was a veteran himself, though he'd served in the Navy rather than the Army, and he'd developed a subtle rapport with Sarah based on shared understanding of military efficiency and attention to detail. Harrison never asked about her background directly, but there were moments when his eyes would narrow slightly, as if he recognized something familiar in the way she carried herself or organized her workspace. Through Harrison, Sarah had gained access to building schematics and maintenance schedules that most employees never saw, information that had proven invaluable for understanding the tower's structural vulnerabilities and security blind spots. She learned about the service elevators that bypassed normal security checkpoints, the utility access points that could provide alternate routes between floors, the communication systems that could be disrupted to isolate different sections of the building. Harrison shared this information casually, treating her as a trusted colleague rather than a potential security risk, never suspecting that she was memorizing every detail with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained in urban warfare tactics.